So it's lovely to see you all, and thanks so many of you for turning up today. This is the culmination of a really long-standing discussion that a group of us have been having. So you've just heard from Ruby, Katy, and I. Magda from FemFund is not able to join us today because of the situation in Poland at the moment. But the four of us have the perspective from various different participatory grant-making organisations, including Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, and the Wikimedia Foundation, and the Edge Fund in the UK, and Fund Action, and FemFund, obviously. And we were having a really interesting conversation about why conflict of interest is so substantially different in participatory grant making, but also the fact that it's often used as a sort of a barrier to foundations engaging in participatory approaches. And often, sometimes that might be in good faith because they can't understand how it might work, but often it's used as an excuse. And so it's one of the questions that comes up the most when we're talking to traditional foundations or traditional grant making traditional grant makers. They'll say, but how do you deal with conflict of interest? So we wrote this article for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and then we thought we'd have a bit more of a deep dive in this conversation today, particularly because there's so many participatory grant makers on this call who will have so much for us to learn from and so much to offer. And I've already heard from, in the breakout groups we just had, the idea of moving from conflict of interest to the notion of embedded relationships, which I really liked. But I thought we could start by talking about why is it that we use this notion of conflict of interest in philanthropy? Where does it come from? And in the first instance, obviously, it's adopted from the business and political sphere, and it can make a lot of sense there. So, you know, if you're working in government, you don't want to be, well, ideally, you don't want to be unduly influenced by corporate lobbies or have yourself financially benefiting from government contracts that you might be giving, or the same in the private sector as well, in businesses. And so conflict of interest policies can make sense in terms of a useful and necessary part of due diligence to perhaps expose or perhaps guard against particular types of corruption even. And it can curtail sort of self-serving behavior by people that are set to benefit financially in different ways. But I think the challenge is why are we adopting this whole scale? Why are we adopting so many things whole scale from the corporate world? But why would we just simply copy and paste this into our sector? Because our sector is completely different. We are not here to make financial benefits. We don't exist for profit. So if we move to the next slide, I think we can start to think about the way in which just simply copying and pasting, adopting this concept or adopting this approach doesn't serve our ultimate ends of justice and equity. And in the first instance, it can become a real tick box exercise. Those of you that have interacted with larger foundations will know that often it is just something, an additional hoop that you have to jump through, an additional bureaucratic hoop for funders and funder staff and grantees. And so instead of having any sort of deeper understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve or avoid, or ways in which we can learn or be more transparent, or a lot of the things that just came up in the chat. Instead, it's just another form, another box that needs to be ticked on a database. And also, one of the things that I think is important to note is that it doesn't actually often, it might do, but it doesn't necessarily impede influence. And so I'm sure that you're all familiar with circumstances where particular board members or others have lobbied or put influence onto into the grant making process to get particular pet projects of theirs funded, or funding things that they're on the board for, or that they want to be on the board for, or that they want to have access to. And this gets to the thing that I think is the most important point about why we adopt, questioning why we adopt it, is that the question of who benefits is really different, is a really different conversation in philanthropy, because it's way more complex than financial benefit. And I think that's really clear, because the goals of organizations aren't usually about profit maximization. They're normally, there's a lot more complexity to the benefit question in terms of capital. So when we're talking about financial benefit, we're talking about monetary capital, but we also have social and political and cultural capital. And so many people are involved in philanthropic projects because of many other reasons apart from money. I can't imagine that many people are involved for money. Instead, there's the notions of prestige or power or influence or wanting to do good or some kind of sense of duty. And so it seems very reductive to take something that's supposed to reduce the likelihood of someone financially benefiting and then applying it to this much more complicated notion. And so this simplistic account of just having a tick box sheet doesn't really take into account power and privilege, and doesn't take into account the benefits that some people might accrue from asking for a particular project to be funded or not. And then there's the flip side to that, and that's the idea of benefit as being a positive thing. So you could say that a disabled person may benefit from having better access to buildings, but does that make them biased? Of course not. As a feminist, I would hope that feminist policy making would benefit me, but I wouldn't consider this as a conflict. And so I think one of the things that I want to end on is the fact that participatory grant making really at its core problematizes the notion of bias and objectivity and neutrality in the philanthropic process. And part of this is questioning conflict of interests and how this works when you're not just talking about simple monetary gain. And on that note, I'll hand over to Katy. Thanks.
Thank you, Rose. If we can move to the next slide, we will make it give it a little more nuance, because I think one of the things that we've realized in this multi-year-long conversation about conflicts of interest is that we actually don't have a lot of shared agreement in our sector about what a conflict of interest is. And we have been using radically different language, which isn't necessarily helping us. So I would propose considering a different set of definitions and being clear about what we mean by each of them. So in philanthropy, a conflict of interest could mean that you will personally benefit from a grant, meaning if you are currently or if you've recently been a board member or a staff member or a contractor, that you will benefit from that, meaning that your fiduciary responsibility as a board member, or that you will benefit from the payment as a staff member or a contractor. So that could be considered a straight up conflict of interest. But what is not a conflict of interest? Well, if you know a grant applicant, if you've crossed paths, if you've been friends with somebody on the staff, if you've been a member of the campaign, if you've donated to their organization, and many, many more scenarios. I love the participatory grant makers that put forth like specific scenarios for their groups of decision makers to consider and review and to have discussions, because what matters most is that the deciders are clear on what those conflicts are. So those scenarios I gave, some of them may be more of a conflict of loyalty, which is a slightly different concept. And Peter Broder in Law Now describes conflicts of loyalty as a situation where a member of a decision-making body owes a duty or is influenced by an affiliation with an entity for which the matter is being decided. And the affiliation could be formal or informal. So that may be something you want to go back and read, and I'll drop a link to this paper, and I want to credit Winifred Olive for sharing this paper with me too, and helping consider the nuance here. But in many cases, we do believe that actually we might be talking about a perceived conflict of interest, where someone might actually think a decision maker has a conflict, but there may not be one. So that's a slightly different situation, will require different mitigation strategies. And finally, the issue of bias that Rose mentioned is also a very real issue for every single human being in philanthropy, outside of philanthropy, and beyond. So we know that each of us as decision makers, no matter what role we play, does bring bias into the process. And many participatory grant makers engage in conversations about bias, implicit, explicit bias, et cetera. And those are really important conversations and trainings, et cetera. So I've confuse this and complicate it a little bit more, but I think that the main point we have is that a blunt conflict of interest tool is actually probably not the right tool for us to be using. And we see value in exploring the difficult and complex nuance in these topics of conflicts. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Beyond the many kinds of conflicts or the bias that can enter any decision-making process, we want to be clear about why it's so important to consider in participatory philanthropy and participatory grantmaking. And that's because, as Rose said, it's often cited as one of the top barriers for why funders don't move in this direction. They're keen to often say, look, people making decisions would have conflicts of interest, that people close to the issues are conflicted out of making decisions. So the assumption then, as I understand it, is that having distance from the community, from the issue, provides a decision maker with a sense of neutrality. And that distance itself creates impartiality and objectivity. But we would argue actually that distance offers a lot more challenge than benefits. We believe that people closest to the issues, closest to the communities, closest to the injustice are much better positioned to make decisions. As y'all know, we believe that. The people who are closest to these issues know actors, they know history, they know conflicts, they know solutions, they know what's at stake. And the mantra of much of our work is who knows better about what solutions are needed than the people of experiencing that injustice themselves. So what we would offer is that funders are missing in experiencing and considering conflicts of interest. The very distance itself is a missed opportunity. So participatory grant makers acknowledge this issue, and many, if not most of us, have official conflicts of interest policies and processes that formally mitigate potential and real conflicts. So I think it's also worth saying, as many of you know, that when participatory grant makers convene groups of people into the space, that those people who become decision makers are often even more interested in the integrity of the process, in their reputations, in their relationships, et cetera. And they often disclose potential and real conflicts even before we ask them to, before the policy is declared, et cetera, that integrity really matters to them. And we should all move forward with that integrity. Next slide. So I wanted to end my chat with talking a little bit about a concept that we've been learning about from Magda. And we know that social movements are grounded in communities that form around solidarity and values and connection and love and friendship and trust, and that these should be recognized and nurtured in our conflicts of interest frameworks, rather than considering these things as something that would offend our objectivity. So Magda from the Fem Fund in Poland, as Rose was saying, talks about the work that she's done in that article that we shared with you, and we hope you'll all read it. And she said, after the experience of our first call for proposals, we decided not to use this term anymore. We came to the conclusion that neither we nor the applicants feel comfortable with the term and the politics it implies. But that doesn't mean that they neglect to manage discomforts and potential and real conflicts. Actually, FemFund is nurturing ongoing reflections about privilege and justice and all of these things with the group that they're working with. But they don't use that standard conflicts approach. In fact, their approach is about radically trusting people. So we want to ask ourselves and you what we could gain if we actually shifted our approach to embedding relationships, to centering love and connection and trust. And we hope that as a part of our ongoing attempts to reflect on our power and privilege in philanthropy, that we will reconsider our approach to conflicts of interest and evolve them, considering the power dynamics always and centering those relationships. Next slide, and over to Ruby, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And just to say, I really love the sort of reclaiming of the language and already the suggestion that was shared in the chat. And I just wanted to lift up another grant maker that is exploring sort of different language. And that's CRIF, the Child Rights Innovation Fund, and Dr. Ramatu Bangaru, who they've actually renamed their policy relationships of value and interest instead of conflict of interest. I believe that's the last time we checked in. So yeah, just to say, I think there's some really interesting sort of reclaiming of language happening across the sector. So I'm going to share a little bit of an example, try to get quite practical actually of how we've managed real perceived conflict or conflict of loyalty, as Katie put it, with the Global Resilience Fund. And I'll also just share a little bit about my experience in other feminist funders, a little bit about Frida, and just my current work, working as an independent consultant. And yes, and we'll drop that in the chat, Ellie. And the Global Resilience Fund is basically, it's a pop-up fund that emerged during the pandemic, made up of 25 funders. And the reason, just want to share this example also because it's it's a collaborative fund, and it really from the very beginning was modeled off sort of the trust and the relationships, and was only made possible because of that existing across the different funders and activists that were part of it. So, and it really kind of informed the ethos of the fund, and like that networking kind of approach enabled it to kind of move extremely quickly. And so we have a participatory process that basically a group of activists from different parts of the world review and make decisions on funding. And many of those activists are also part of groups that were eligible and were actually applying for funding. So we had quite a few cases where the panelists who were reviewing actually had been in the call for proposals and their applications were being reviewed. So, and just to share very practically like how we addressed it, and I guess sort of what we learned through that process. So we asked activists very clearly to, to share if they felt they might have a real or perceived conflict from the beginning, sort of before they received applications. And, this was a range of ways, and some of them disclosed, okay, their group was applying. And what we did was then basically shared that publicly with all the other activists who were part of the process. And they still reviewed applications. They didn't review their own, obviously. And then they still joined the kind of review panel where we all came together. They shared their kind of feedback on the applications they'd reviewed. All applications were reviewed by 2 panelists. And then they just stepped out of the call. So they weren't part of the formal sort of deliberation, the final decision making, but they were still able to participate in the process. And they felt comfortable and respected by being part of that. So their expertise was really valued. And I think we just received fantastic feedback from those activists who were part of the process, because kind of about creating an environment where they were comfortable to express that. It didn't penalize them. They could still apply for funding, even though they were part of the process. And they were, I guess, not putting their relationships with their communities at risk also, because that was really transparently shared throughout the process. So I think, and the value of having activists who are part of these decision-making processes is so valuable. And so I think for us, it was about trying to move away from sort of a risk-averse kind of taboo conflict of interest, but really look at, how can we value those relationships. And even the fact that these activists are doing the work, like the reason they're there on those panels is because they know the work, they come from the work, they're groups that can apply. So, and really not making that really difficult decision for them that they don't participate in the process, because that means they can't be funded, but they just step back, step forward and, decide how to engage, and that was really supported. So, and I think often what I've found through my work is that it's often the perceived conflict that is really the most of a challenge for people, and that is a real challenge for activists as well, that they don't want to be perceived that they're taking advantage of that position. And I think unfortunately, even though we know there's enough resources for all of this work out there, there's still sort of a mental kind of model and feelings of scarcity and competition in movement and in our work. And I think sometimes the way that funders can work, if they're not really conscious and supportive of these processes, can actually further drive competition. So supporting activists to feel like really supported throughout that process, and that their relationships are not being undermined with movement as well, has been a big part of it. And some of the learnings, so just starting from a place of trust and openness, and really, a human approach that just prioritizes like creating space to talk through the kind of discomforts. And just the stickiness. And just to share another example, sort of not in the Resilience Fund, but in other places where I've been involved, I've had people on my board who are also my grantee partner, or were part of being funded by the organization I was, leading or part of at the time. And I think there have been moments where it gets like power moves in really strange ways, and it's like confusing, and like you're just navigating that together. And I think just like being able to sort of be in that messiness and be really honest about sometimes where it feels a little bit like this is heading into a place where it doesn't feel comfortable, or, and just talking through that with a lot of honesty, but also self-awareness, but just trying to create an environment that's actually caring and supportive for activists, but that still means they get the resources for their work and they can still be part of, meaningful decision making. So just wrap up quickly because we've got lots to get through, but I think I've seen conflict of interest sort of processes go wrong often is where there's sort of either nothing or too much. So I have seen where there's no process at all, and there's this kind of really trying to trust and embody all these values, and then sometimes there isn't that sort of space to name or to be really explicit or just to create that environment for people to have that transparency. So I do think that it is important to open up these things and just to support the conversations to happen. And then on the other spectrum, I've really seen just like really risk adverse, kind of just a lot of fear and all the things that Rose and Katy have been speaking about. So I think just trying to, really work through it together. And the final thing I'll just say is that I think we all wear many hats, and our relationships and our identities are obviously complex and intersectional, and just trying to find a way to support, thriving relationships across movement and across the funding ecosystem, and just being really comfortable with what we don't know and just sort of start to unpack that, I think. So I'm really grateful for this space and to continue talking. So thank you. Pass over to Katy maybe, or Rose.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the radical trust element actually, because I think we've already heard about the fantastic work that FemFund have done, and it's a shame that Magda's not here to talk a little bit more about how they have this sort of sophisticated approach to holding the space, as you were talking about, Ruby, to getting sticky and having a bit more of a sophisticated discussion and conversation that actually builds trust and builds community and allows us to surface any of these tensions. Whereas the organizations that I've been involved with, it's more about the practicalities of having a conflict of interest policy when everybody is wearing so many hats, exactly as you said, Ruby, and having been involved in the Edge Fund and Fund Action as well for so many years. When I joined a traditional philanthropic organization, the notion of conflict of interest it was so jarring, because how would you determine Magda, for example, she is a member of Fund Action, and so she has received grants from Fund Action, but she's also a decision maker at Fund Action, and she's also been involved in various different processes at Fund Action, and that's just Magda. There's so many different hats that she's wearing in that process. And so at Edge Fund, at least, and I think at Fund Action as well, but Vasilis perhaps can talk more about this, the notion of radical trust is just, don't be a dick, basically, and don't vote on your own proposals. We're not going to police this, but just don't vote on your own proposals and don't do anything to sort of sabotage others or whatever, because when you are working across so many different languages or contexts and everybody doesn't know each other intimately, you can't necessarily have those really open and generative conversations where you have a more sophisticated model. And this can cause challenges as well. But I feel as though the radical trust model has given us surprisingly good results. But also one of the things that Ruby was saying that really resonated with me was the fact that there's also a sense of suspicion there. So even though we see a real wide variety of organizations get funded using this radical trust model, there's also a sense of suspicion that, are people are just going to vote for themselves, or are the people just going to vote for their friends? And so having a bit of a conversation about this, I think, is probably preferable than just the very minimal approach, as you put it, Ruby. But I'd love to hear from others whether they've got examples as well.
So the last example that we wanted to share with you comes to us from the International Trans Fund. And I've been scanning through the little icons to make sure Broden isn't here, but I don't think, has anyone seen Broden? Can anyone tell me if Broden is here? Because I don't want to speak for International Trans Fund if he's here. Okay, I'm going to assume, I know he had a conflict that he was trying to move. So what we want to share with you is some specific language. We don't recommend that you necessarily copy and paste it from them, but they have been so generous in sharing their policy online. And I just want to read a few sentences of it to you. They say, as a participatory and community-led grant maker, we value involving activists from various diverse and intersectional backgrounds and the variety of trans movements while building and maintaining a sustainable and trusted funding institution. We also acknowledge that the initial notions of conflicts of interest are rooted in a corporate and bureaucratic definition of conflict of interest by predominantly rich, white, cis men to consolidate and increase their own wealth. And finally, I want to share, they say, we recognize that trans activists operating in the global South are more likely to be impacted by this policy and have conflicts of interest due to patterns of funding available globally, whilst global North organizations have been funded at a greater level and therefore are less likely to qualify for ITF funding. So I think that this policy that they have laid out, and we'll share the link in the chat with you, is a really interesting way to kind of frame it for their community right off. And what's interesting about the way they approach this policy is that they're constantly learning from it. And they have actually, as I understand it, adapted their policy based on the feedback they've gotten from their own community. So it's not necessarily a fixed and permanent policy that you use forevermore, but rather a tool to unearth, discuss, and mitigate potential and real conflicts. And then you learn from it and you make changes to it and you improve upon it over time. It's not fixed in stone, just like basically nothing in participatory grant making is fixed in stone. So that was the final example that we wanted to share. I'm going to paste it in the chat for y'all. Anyone from the audience have a conflict of interest policy that you might offer us to share a little bit more?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? This is Diana.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm the founding director of the Disability Rights Fund, currently transitioning out after 14 years and joining compatriots of mine in the consulting world. We built a conflict of interest policy at DRF that changed over time. Initially, it was, I would say, more conservative, so that people with disabilities who were in our global advisory panel and who were selected to sit on our grant making committee were not, their organizations and their networks could not apply for funding. But we found pretty quickly that that was very unfair. And that it meant that only those who had ample funds could participate. And that cut down on the diversity of voices within the grant making committee, voices we wanted to hear from. So we changed the policy to say that anyone could participate, and their organizations and networks could still be applicants for funding. But if their organization or the network that they were deeply involved in was an applicant for funding, they would just need to recuse themselves from that particular decision about funding for that organization or network. And that worked pretty well. I want to say one other thing, which is that in the Disability Rights Fund, the grant making committee has both donor members and global activists from the disability movement. And the reason for that was that there was so little knowledge in the funding community about the disability rights movement that it was set up as a learning mechanism so that donors could learn from disability activists, and disability activists could also learn donor language and all of and build these relationships which are critical, as we all know. And the conflict of interest policy applied to everyone in the committee, to the donor representatives as well. So I think that's really important to write the balance, that everyone has to talk about their potential conflicts of interest, not just activists. Thanks for listening.
I believe Broden has joined.
I have.
Yay! Hi, Broden. Would you like to share a little bit We just shared the link and a little bit of your language, but we'd love to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so sorry I'm coming in so late in this discussion. There's so many people here. I'm sure it was very rich. And I do apologize if I'm going to speak briefly, but if I cover things that you've already talked about, please, my bad. But just to let people know, my name is Broden Jambroni, and I'm the director at the International Trans Fund, or ITF. We're a participatory grant maker, and our role really is to support trans-led groups across the globe. We increase capacity for trans movements to self-organize and advocate for their rights, for their well-being, and for self-determination. So just a little bit of background there. But in terms of our conflict of interest process, and it has been a process, when we started and we first designed our participatory grant-making mechanism, we did allow our grant-making panel, which is a body of 15 trans activists who make all the decisions about our grants, to also be able to apply for our grants. And, we recognize, the reason for this is we recognize that, conflict of interest, the notion of conflict of interest are rooted in corporate and bureaucratic definitions, predominantly, I suppose, articulated and designed by rich, white, cis men to consolidate their own wealth. And, folks who we're working with, trans-led groups in the global south, are most likely to be impacted by this policy because of the patterns of funding available globally. So, we were thinking, what is this going to actually mean for our organization? So we started by leaving it very open. And we did have a conflict of interest where people disclosed any relationship that they had with groups that might be applying. But that didn't prevent them from applying. And we went through this for about 3 years. And we did put in various mitigation factors, like people who were applying for funding, obviously they would not review their own applications. They wouldn't be in the room when we were discussing the applications. And largely this worked in a lot of ways. The vast majority of the organizations we funded were not from our grant making panel. However, there were some that did come out. But what we did find through this process was that there was a growing perception outside of the ITF that in fact we were, to get money through the ITF, you needed to be on our grant making panel, which obviously, gave us a bit of a start and really, I suppose, infringed or I guess challenged what we believe are our fundamental values, which are things like transparency, equity, trust, and justice. So we changed our policy about 2 years ago, and we did say that actually if you're part of our grant making panel or our board, you are not able to apply for funding for now. But with the recognition and the cognizance that, these types of policies, they can and do need to change. And that we want to make sure that by putting this in, we're not creating a barrier to folks participating in our grant making panel because they want to apply for funding, or they are participating in the grant making panel, but they're unable to access funding that is much needed on the ground. So it's this kind of constant tension that we're still working through. And actually our conflict of interest policy is coming up for, renewal or consideration or discussion to see if it did have that impact. Did it change the perception of ITF? Has it meant that, we've added extra barriers to folks' participation or moving money, which is definitely something we don't want. And we don't have the answer to that yet. That's something that we will, hopefully we can come back to another session down the line. But I'm very sad I didn't get to hear other people's experiences around this, but we found it to be very challenging and something that we've really, gone to the root of the organization to talk about and to think about what does it mean? Like this expectation that conflict of interest means the same thing to everyone or should be, blanketly applied, obviously doesn't and has very specific meanings for certain communities, global trans-led movements being one of them. So we're kind of constantly wrestling with that. I'll stop there, but I'm very happy to be part of this discussion.
Well, we really appreciate your comments and thoughts and the leadership of the International Trans Fund in this space, because literally when we used to Google this topic, this was the only thing that came up. So we're just so grateful that you have been so willing to share with the rest of us a little bit about not only what you do and how you do it, but what you're learning from it and what we can all learn from it too, because it's a big contribution to the conversation. So at this point, we want to ask you all in the chat to share a few words that drive your conflicts of interest policy, either the values or approaches that you think should be central moving forward. Hopefully, we've offered some ideas that you can learn from, but what are some of the values that you might take forward for your own conflicts of interest policy? If you can share in the chat, that would be awesome. I see transparency, trust, humanity, valuing people's knowledge and connection to community, trust, equal treatment of all. Relationships matter. They do. Radical trust, embedded relationships, understanding and integrity, openness. All right, well, while people continue to add some thoughts in the chat, I'm going to hand it over to you, Kelly.
Thanks. So we wanted to make some time. I know we only have a few minutes left to see if there's any burning questions from the audience around this topic. I did see a lot of requests in the chat previously about resources, like if there's any key resources that you all have used or any recommendations for the process for like coming up with a conflicts of interest policy.
I can just jump in quickly on that one. We've got a slide at the end of this with some tools, but I think perhaps it might be nice to see if there was a space online, perhaps on the Slack channel for the Participatory Grantmakers community of practice, where people can share their policies there. And I've been trying to type and respond to the message that I think Latresh has been asking about whether or not we've got anything written about how we dealt at Edge Fund with challenges and putting the radical trust approach to the test. And I don't think we've got anything specifically written down. Our membership and community guidelines both say if you have a conflict of interest, then please recuse yourself, but it doesn't really go into any details about what that is. So it kind of leaves that up to the individuals to determine whether or not they have a conflict. And yeah, and then we just ask people to step back. And obviously that then makes it very hard to police or implement. And it's more about being able to point to the values so that if you see some sort of conflict of interest actually actively happening, or someone complains about this, or someone suspects this, you can point to the values and say, look, we have these values, and one of them is the radical trust model, and one of them is ensuring that we are fair and open and transparent, etc. So I think having a more explicit and articulated model like the one that Broden just shared, it would be great if we were able to put that on the Slack channel or share those somewhere beyond the slide that we have at the end of this deck. I don't know, Katie and Ruby, do you have anything you want to add on that, or can people drop some of these examples perhaps in the chat?
I did see there was a request for some scenarios, and I have seen many of us on this call and others create those kind of scenarios, just like not making it too difficult to come up with. Katie is an employee of X organization and she's interested in joining. Is that a conflict of interest? Having that conversation with a group and making it a little silly and fun. I remember one funder who's here on the call had a really silly set of examples and people were just laughing and laughing and laughing, but it gave them the tools to get into understanding what real conflicts of interest were and how we would deal with them as a community. So I think having that not getting too serious about those potential scenarios is a fun way to engage when you're doing orientation or onboarding with a group of participatory decision makers. It's a good way to go.
Well, I think I'll quickly share the resources that you all have put together to share with everyone. Here's just a few links. I think I can also throw these in the chat for everyone. And yeah, Rose, I love the idea of continuing this conversation, maybe on Slack or Google Groups. if people want to sort of workshop specific specific questions that they have. And if you want to join our Google group or Slack, you can do that on our website at participatorygrantmaking.org. Yeah, any final words, Katy, Ruby, or Rose?
I wanted to make just one last point, and that's about the influence generally. So we're talking a lot about reviewing proposals and who gets to allocate where funding goes here in terms of choosing a proposal. But I think we need to accept and acknowledge, and we've already been talking about this throughout, that influence happens way before that. You know, whoever's setting the agenda and who's deciding on the geographical or thematic focus, like that is real power. And so going further down the chain as thinking about who gets to decide on what proposal is important, but I think we also need to have a conversation about who is setting the agenda in the first instance. But that's perhaps for another discussion. Thanks.
I think my final word would just be that there is no perfect magic template process, et cetera, that will, you know, do all of these things perfectly and safeguard all the individuals involved and prioritize trust and all of that. It is iterative, and it is something that you can just start with and see how it goes, and then ask people what they think about it. Not only the people who are involved, but people who are outside of the organization, if they're activists, if they're movement, if they're people in community, asking them about their perceptions. And of course, sharing back what you hear with them is really important to do. So there is no perfect solution, but I do think there are some examples out there, including International Trans Fund, that we can use as a starting place.
Very briefly, just to say, yeah, really echo what Rose and Katy said. And I think just reading Zora's comment in the chat, like just recognizing sometimes these things happen and also harm can take place, and just really recognizing and holding, like when there are situations where something isn't managed well, or, you know, just creating space to work through that. And I think we're all in a learning curve and trying to create open conversation with activists who are part of participatory processes, just to continue to sort of have honest dialogue about this, because yeah, I think the impact can go on for quite a long time in community and in movement as well. So really, like with care, just trying to create that space. So I just appreciated the comments in the chat as well. So yeah, and thank you. It's very late on my end, so just to say, really grateful to be here, but it's very middle of the night, and just I'm very grateful for this space. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruby and Katy and Rose. And we'll be sending our thoughts to Magda, who couldn't be here today. But this is, yeah, I just really appreciate your insights on this topic. And for everyone who's watching, we will put a recording of this up on our YouTube channel, so you can revisit it every day and enjoy the insights. And yeah, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.